Okay, hello. Wet dog. Yesterday talked about downward mobility, and that in response to the kenosis, the self-emptying love of God, that we too need to go downwards. But of course, my friend Glenn, who's a Baptist minister, reminded me that what goes down comes up. And actually we see that in Christ himself. He doesn't stay incarnated. He dies on the cross, which John describes as his glory. And of course, he's raised again in resurrection. And as the at-one-ment, as I've talked about in at-one-ment, he dies, he lives like us at one with us, and dies and suffers at one with us. And then we are raised at one with him. But what's interesting is where humans kind of raise up certain individuals, God raises up different individuals. So in human terms, generally the people who are successful on the whole, or in the world's level of success, the people who rise to the top are generally male. They're often white, and they're often either middle class or upper class, or come from privilege rather than poverty. But God does something different. He doesn't raise necessarily those people. And it starts off with, I think we need to understand, first of all, the mission of Jesus in terms of the temple, what Jesus does at the temple. And I think we don't always understand the clearing and cleansing of the temple that he does. Because in Matthew's account, Jesus cleanses the temple, and then afterwards, children sing, and he starts healing. And for us, it's just like, well, that's what he did, doesn't it? That's quite interesting, children sing, and he starts healing. That's what he normally does. But actually, that's a really important, significant detail, because the temple had a series of courts, and the Holy of Holies was where the chief priest went once a year. Then you had the court of the priests. Then you had the court of the Israelites. Now, the court of the Israelites is where Jesus does the healings. But in the court of the Israelites, only pure, clean, Jewish men were allowed to enter. No children, no sick, no women. They were limited to the next court, which is the court of the women. And then the final court was the court of the Gentiles. And so when Jesus cleanses the temple, he blows open all of those different walls and makes it possible for people to come to him. And Jesus is offering a new temple system, one that doesn't have those rigid walls. But we tend to build up those walls wherever possible. The classic, examples would be historically. I mean, first of all, I'm talking, about my friend Glenn. Now, Glenn's interesting because he's a Baptist minister, and he also happens to be blind, and he's faced different elements of being excluded because of that. That might be that he doesn't get the jobs he deserves because of that. He's one of the major Baptist forces behind the social justice and justice movements. And so even today, if you go to a church, they'll often say, "Oh, right, worship time, please stand." But they don't say stand if you're able. There's just a subtle difference, but it's massive if you are unable to stand. So disabilities, one. Ethnic minorities, and obviously now we have quite a lot of black majority churches, but when people from the Caribbean first came over here, they were very clearly unwelcome in white churches. That's why they had to form their own. But, the church justified slavery. The church justified the apartheid movements, even justified, a lot of, when missionaries went out into various places, native people were told convert or die. So it justified a level of racism. Luckily, also, church has also been clearly sort of moving in the direction of also helping that and healing that. So we look at, the Wilberforce and the anti-slavery movement. We look at Martin Luther King and his movement towards creating an equal society in America. So the church is both good and bad in that. Then there's LGBTQ issues. People are still alienated or kept away from church because of their sexual or gender identities. But actually, the one I want to focus on is actually just issues of gender. And I think it's really important because gender comes back right to the heart of the story. It's the oldest form of difference between humans. It's the only oldest form. Patriarchy is the strongest, one of the strongest pulls towards who we exclude and who we include. And of course, the story of Genesis begins with Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, it quite clearly says that men and women were created equal. And then there's the story of Adam and Eve, and actually Adam, of course, Eve comes out of Adam, which actually, if you look at the history of creation order, it goes in sort of creation order towards the highest people. So actually women should be the most important, but they're obviously clearly not, often excluded. And then there's the story of the snake and Eve being the person who tempts man, human, as in the gender man, as opposed to mankind, and then there's that story of where women and men are created, are then in the present, after sin has entered the world, that the differences between the roles are defined. And it's ironic that often people use Genesis to say, created order, and yet actually, if you look at the good creation, there's an equality in creation. And then when Jesus comes along, what we see is that he does some extraordinary things when it comes to women. He meets the Samaritan woman in public. He allows the woman who'd been bleeding for years to touch him. He lets Mary sit at his feet, the position of a disciple. The women are the first to be the witnesses of resurrection. Jesus does amazing things, allowing women to become equal in what he does, and yet at the same time we find ways of doing the opposite. And then of course the early church, I think a lot of early church movements, beginning from the early church itself, have included a lot of women in their leadership positions. So Romans 16 talk about women as deacons, apostles, lead ministers in ministry couples. We've got that clearly in there in Romans 16. Galatians, Paul says there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. There is a clear sense of desire for equality. But what happens is we tend to take small proof texts and blow them up and make them into doctrines. And actually you see it throughout history where women have become leadership positions. You see it. Pelagius raised up women and then was beaten down by Augustine, who was pretty much a misogynist. Then you have early movements like the Celtic churches had quite a lot of women in leaderships. They had mixed monasteries where women led the monastery. They were the chief people in the monastery. You have some of the early separatist movements had women leaders. English separatists had women leaders. A lot of early church movements have women in leadership, and yet at the same time, somewhere along the line, patriarchy creeps in and takes it away. Jesus, though, wants to raise up the people that everyone else ignores. That's why the Magnificat is such an important piece of writing in the early part of Luke, where Mary, the Song of Mary, says that the poor are raised up while the rich go away empty, and that's such a different from our society. And that's so God does raise up people, but often he raises up the people we don't expect. He raises up the people that everyone else ignores, the people who've been excluded and rejected and who've not been given leadership positions. God raises those people up rather than the people we expect should be raised up. So, downwardly mobile leads to God raising up in an upward direction, but never, ever, ever the people we expect them to be.